Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of There's a Stat for That. I'm the Poli Sci guy, Dr. David Searcy, here joining you from the beautiful campus of Southwestern Oklahoma State University in Weatherford, Oklahoma. And this week, the today I want to talk about one of those three B's that we talked about in the first episode, and that is belonging, and how we categorize that in the United States. So in the United States, the largest religious faith by far is Christianity. Even in an era of increased secularization, sometimes used described as the rise of the nuns, we still find that a majority of Americans, probably even more closer to a supermajority, about 2/3 of Americans, still identify with the Christian faith. But as we kind of talked about last time, if you drive around your home community, whatever your home community happens to be, you'll see lots of different aspects of Christianity, lots of different Christian organizations. We call those denominations, and there are literal hundreds of them. So, how do we account for that? A lot of times my students in my upper division classes, when I put this question to them, they will say, well, why don't we just categorize everybody into their own denomination? We'll treat each denomination as its own separate category. The problem with that is that there are literally hundreds of different Christian denominations in the United States. And when we break people down into those very narrow things and treat each one as its own independent thing, we get so many categories that, except for the few largest, we can't really run any statistics on it. If I only have 3 adherents of a particular denomination, let's use a small denomination like the Community of Christ as an example. If I only have 3 adherents in my survey, there's a limited amount of information I can say about the Community of Christ as a whole. We can't run statistics on that. So, how do social scientists account for this diversity while also putting people into large enough categories that we can actually run some meaningful data on? And that's our topic for today. Now, we have been doing scientific surveys for almost 100 years. And if you look at the really classic surveys done by Gallup back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they're using a very simple categorization scheme for Christianity. They basically cut Christianity into 2 groups. You have Protestants and you have Catholics. That's Christianity. In fact, a famous sociological explanation of this is found in this classic book by Will Herberg, which was originally published in 1955, that divides American religious faith into 3 categories: Protestant, Catholic, Jew. Seems simple enough, right? Why don't we just do that? Well, there's a lot of problems with that. The first one is that may not be super obvious to you, is that there are a lot of forms of Christianity in the United States that do not fit neatly into either category. They are neither Protestant nor Catholic. The Orthodox are a great example of this. The Orthodox Church has its origin in a split with the Catholic Church that predates the Protestant Reformation by about 500 years, right? So they're not Protestant, but they're not Roman Catholic either. They're something else. In addition, you have groups that develop in the United States with very particular beliefs that are not really consistent with Protestantism either. Now, this is a little controversial, but stick with me here. What does it mean to be a Protestant? What does that term mean? There are different definitions of it. My doctoral advisor used to always say that in order to be Protestant, you had to break directly from the Catholic Church. That's what that term meant. So he would say that Lutherans were Protestant, but Baptists were not. I kind of like that definition, but want to say this clearly, he's 100% wrong. Words meaning changes over time, and the word Protestant today does not mean breaking from the Catholic Church. It just doesn't. But it still takes us back to like, well, what are Protestants? Is there some broader connecting thread, some through line we can draw through the hundreds of different Christian denominations that we could fit under the umbrella of Protestantism? I actually think there is, and that's Trinitarianism. Now, this is not a theological discussion, and the mystery of the Trinity is one of those complicated Christian topics that you could fill entire books on. But we're going to try to come up with a definition we can stick on a bumper sticker. Trinitarianism is the belief that there is one God who exists in three persons: God the Father, God the Son, that's Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. But there are non-Trinitarian Christians. Now, I'm not going to be sitting here and making the argument that being non-Trinitarian makes you non-Christian. I'm not going to do that. That's for the theologians and the philosophers to determine. But what I would say is that being non-Trinitarian makes you non-Protestant. The largest non-Trinitarian Christian groups in the United States are the Jehovah's Witnesses, who do not, so the Jehovah's Witnesses don't fit into that Protestant Catholic divide. But the largest is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often referred to as Mormons. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a non-Trinitarian church. It comes about after the Protestant Reformation, but I wouldn't classify Mormonism as something that fits under Protestantism. It's something else. And if we want to study politics, particularly if we want to study politics in the Mountain West region of this country, and we want to know about the effect of religion, we need a measure that's going to account for Mormonism. Another problem is that Protestantism is actually really diverse on numerous different things, both theological and political. In the big picture sense, we can come up with a similarity like Trinitarianism, but in a lot of the practical senses, we see a lot of diversity. So how do we account for that? Well, after we realize, okay, we can't use this Protestant Catholic divide, one of the next attempts was to use fundamentalism. Now, how do we use fundamentalism? In this, what T.W. Smith did when he came up with his fundamentalism scale was he didn't use fundamentalism as a belief. In the first episode, we talked about using biblical literalism as a measure of a person's belief. Smith didn't do that. Instead, what he did was he classified denominations on a fundamentalist to modernist scale. So you had some that were more fundamentalist and some that were more modernist, and it was like a line, and you could put different denominational groups on that line, and after a certain point, you could draw a line and say, these are fundamentalists and these are not. There are problems with that too, though. One is that we're kind of really making assumptions on a person's belief on something as fundamental as how you should read the Bible based on their denominational affiliation, which is not great. The other problem is that for a lot of groups, Smith lumped denominational families together. And so what is a denominational family? Well, if a denomination is a formal organization of churches, a family refers to a group of them that fit into like a theological categorization. So Baptists, there are denominations within Baptist. The term Baptist is the family. And as we start getting into the more modern times, we start to see, and you see this particularly in Robert Withnow's book about the restructuring of American religion, you begin to see, or social scientists began to notice and discuss the fact that there are divisions within denominational families. And in fact, Withnow actually argues that those divisions are actually becoming, and he's arguing this in 1988, these divisions are becoming more important than actual denominations. There's another problem with doing this, though, and that has to do with surveys and how they're conducted. In a later discussion, won't it's not for this one. I'll talk about how denomination is tracked in surveys, but it's long, involves a lot of different questions and follow-ups and strings and things. It's fairly easy to do in an internet surveys and in phone surveys where the person is punching it in. It's harder to do in person. And sometimes you need to do a survey that is short. Exit polling is an example of this. So exit polling are polls done like on people as they exit polling places on election day. Those surveys need to be short because you're trying to catch people as they're coming out of a building. They might give you a few minutes of their time, but then they've got to get back in their car and go to work, or they have family things or whatever. Or maybe you're catching them on the way home. They've gone to work. They're voting. They're stopping to vote on their way home, and you're catching them and preventing them from getting home. So they're not going to take a 20-minute survey, but they might take a 5-minute one. And so in these kinds of scenarios, you don't have time to devote to all the branching questions that tracking denominationalism requires. You need a shorthand. Fundamentalism has a obvious shorthand. You can just ask people, are you a fundamentalist? You're not doing it exactly the way T.W. Smith would have argued you should have done, but it gives you a kind of rough approximation. The problem, though, is that by the time we get to the 1980s and the 1990s, the term fundamentalist has become a politically loaded term. It wasn't at one point, becomes very politically loaded. And all we mean when we say politically loaded is that it is a term or an identity that is closely associated with one political party as opposed to the other. So by the time you get to the 80s and the 90s, fundamentalism is very much associated with politically conservative Christianity. And lots of people are replying to that question with that in mind. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but think about it. If I'm using the term if the term fundamentalism reflects a political divide and not a religious divide, then when I use it in a survey trying to track the effect of religion on politics, I'm not measuring the same thing. I'm asking you in the term of, are you a fundamentalist? And that term reflects a theological belief. But you're understanding it, that term fundamentalism, as, are you a conservative Christian? Even though they're not the same thing. So we were using the term fundamentalist to try and track the effect of religion on politics, but the term we were using was telling us as much as about how politics affects religion. So we needed something else. And in 2000, in a classic article, a new classification of Protestantism came about, which, while there have been some minor tweaks in the last few years, is still probably the dominant way in which Protestantism is classified. Unlike using an official denominational belief like fundamentalism, what it is inspired by that, but instead it uses historical development to separate different Christians into different categories using religious tradition. And the idea here is that if you look at United States religious history, you have 3 different and distinct religious traditions. You have mainline Protestantism, which is which is kind of the dominant form of Christianity. You then see a breakaway group, and that's evangelicalism, who, as the main line becomes more modernist, breaks away and is more fundamentalist. And then finally, you have the third group, which is historically Black Protestants. Um, the Black Protestant Church is separated not necessarily on theology, but actually on segregation. It's literally segregated. Segregation forced Black Christians out of white churches and into their own churches. Now, these churches, because this process took place a long time ago and then lasted for a long time, these churches then have their own historical development trajectory that's fundamentally different from the white church. Um, and because it is and you can put, the argument here is that you can take all the different denominations of Christianity, you can put them into one of those three religious tracts, and you can then you can separate them out that way because it uses religious tradition, and we used coding schemes that, at least in the beginning, 7 characters was the most you could punch into them. We call this scheme Reltrad, for religious tradition. Reltrad. Um, the nice thing about Reltrad is that, like fundamentalism, it's an easy shorthand. It's a way to separate out Christian diversity. And it has kind of a method that we can use that doesn't have to require us to account for all the different forms of denominationalism. How do we do that? Well, first, we often, when we talk to people, we are already asking their race and ethnicity, so we can separate out the historically Black church by essentially assuming that when we talk to a person of African descent and they tell us they're a Christian, that they are within that historical tradition. Now, that's problematic, and we can talk about that in more detail in a later lecture, but that often is how it's done. And then, to separate out mainliners and evangelicals, we will ask them one simple question. Do you identify yourself as a born again or evangelical Protestant? So we separate them out. By the way, this is not the focus of this lecture. We'll talk about that more in a later one. But this is one reason why sometimes, if you're following along in the news or you see a poll, sometimes you'll see polls that discuss religion and they'll say evangelicals, and they'll do this. Sometimes they'll say white evangelicals. Though there are different ways you can do it, but one reason why you often see the term white evangelical is they're using this kind of simple measure of, hey, are you a Christian? Great. Are you are you born again or evangelical? And those are the only questions they have. And so when they do that and they pull African Americans out, that means that all you're left with, for the most part, are white evangelicals. Reltrad, unfortunately, has a couple of problems, even despite its popularity. The first of which is it doesn't really work intellectually, particularly with modern divisions. What do I mean by that? Well, when the United Methodist Church splits in the 2020s, it is not intellectually honest to say that that breakaway group is part of this evangelical tradition that goes back to the 19th and 20th centuries. You aren't in an evangelical tradition if you split away in the last 5 years. It goes the other way, though, too. Mainliners in this historical conception are often described as these historically dominant traditions that, as they move towards modernism, evangelicalism splits away from. But I happen to be a member of a mainline tradition, the ELCA, which wasn't actually created until 1988. Again, if the denomination formed in my lifetime, it's not part of a historical development that goes back hundreds of years. You can argue that the denominations of Lutheranism that created the ELCA were, but that is not the ELCA. The ELCA is something different. Another place where you can also see this historical kind of inaccuracy in when you discuss the Black church in America too. Um, it's often described and conceptualized using the Baptist and Methodist tradition examples. So, in the Baptist and Methodist traditions, you had existing churches dominated by white people that convert African Americans into the faith, but then segregate them out. And so you have like a strand of historically Black Methodism that's kind of evolving differently at the same time that white Methodist is evolving in its own way. Same with the Baptist example, and so it's often described that way, that it's this that segregation kept it apart. But it's always often described as there was the white church was first, and then we have the Black church. But in Pentecostalism, the story is the exact opposite. The Azusa Street revival was led by William Seymour, who was an African American man. The first organized Pentecostal denomination is not the Assemblies of God. It's actually the Church of God in Christ, or COGIC, which is a historically Black church. So the historical development is flipped. So you can't even say, well, okay, this is the historical story. That's not the case here. The other problem, though, and I think this is probably the bigger of the two problems with Reltrad, is that I would argue that while when it was created that this was not necessarily the case, in 2025, evangelicalism is a political term. So one of the main reasons we needed to get away from fundamentalism was that it had become a political term, and it wasn't telling us what we wanted to know in our surveys. Evangelicalism is at that point today. In fact, it's been at that point for a while. It's inextricably linked to political conservatism. Again, that's not Reltrad's fault. This is inevitable. The longer we find a relationship between a group and a political party, the more closely we associate them, and the more that gets publicized and discussed, the more closely that relationship develops. This is going to happen. Again, I tend to, and this is my own personal belief, but I tend to believe that the term evangelical, like the term fundamentalism, has become so polarized that it's not worth continuing to use it in the social sciences. At a minimum, we need to acknowledge that when we ask that born again or evangelical question, that a person who identifies as evangelical may be doing so because of political and not theological reasons. For example, we find so many people who tell us that they are born again and also Roman Catholic. That's not a term used in the Roman Catholic Church, but it has become so politically associated with political conservatism that what a lot of people are hearing is, am I a politically conservative Catholic? Yes, I am. And so they're identifying there. But until something new takes its place, this is kind of what we're stuck with in the realm of the classification of religious belonging. So, where does that leave us? Well, what it means is that among groups that are large enough to separate and to categorize into big groups that we have enough people in to study in national surveys, we break Christianity now down into the following belonging categories. First, we have Roman Catholicism. Then, among our Protestants, we break Protestants down into three groups. We have evangelicals, we have the mainline, and we have the historically Black church. And then outside of Catholicism and Protestantism, the group that is the largest, that we have enough data often to compare and use in national surveys, is Mormonism, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if you want to be really specific. And we separate out, and in really big academic studies, we'll have enough respondents who fall into our final two categories, the Orthodox and Jehovah's Witnesses, to do something with. But in a lot of studies that use, maybe 1,000 people, we often don't have enough of either of those to tell us anything definitive about them. So we have our kind of 5 groups, and if you're focused, and depending on what part of the country you're in, you may not have enough Mormons either. That's probably enough for today. Thank you for watching. Since we're putting this on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button if you want to see more discussions. I will see you next time where we will break down for lack of a better term, the shibboleth of the question of being born again.